Hello and welcome to episode 4 of The Red Matrix. My name is Byrne Edwards and this is my colleague and friend Sean Bell. Sean was a fighter pilot flying the Harrier jump jet. He brings to this podcast vast experience, having served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Sean, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Since last week, a lot's happened. It seems that everything is going at a blistering rate. Let's start with Ukraine. What's going on?
Yeah, as we were talking about earlier, I think the one shock, is we've sort of become complacent about Ukraine in a way, whereas I think 2 years ago, we probably never would have thought there would be a war of this scale on the European continent. And yet it's not appearing much in the news because we're so shocked about the events in Israel. But that conflict in Ukraine is still extremely vicious, it's brutal, and it's the mounting casualties, particularly on the Russian side at the moment. I think there's 3 areas we're going to quickly look at today, one of which is that for the first time in about 2 months, the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, has come under attack. It came under attack 5 days ago at the weekend. Now, why is it symbolic? Because the Russians aren't looking to take over Kyiv anytime soon. They've got their hands full elsewhere. But that's where the seat of power is. That's where President Zelensky operates. And undoubtedly, this is an effort just to shake him up a bit. But what's fascinating about the attack on Kyiv, though, was that Russia used, I think it was 31 of these Shahed 136 drones that they're buying in en masse from Iran, and also a whole collection of other missiles. Some of them are surface-to-surface naval missiles. Some of them are ballistic missiles. Some of them are surface-to-air missiles that they've modified to go surface-to-surface. And it just shows how much of a struggle it is for Russia at the moment to put a coherent package of weapons together. Now, Kyiv is pretty well protected from missiles. You'll recall that the Americans donated the Patriot missile system, which was very effective in the Gulf War. And they've also got a whole load of smaller systems out there. But one of the things I had a quick look at was, you'd imagine Patriot, it sounds like it's a dome, a bit like the Iron Dome for Israel. It protects from everything. It's very, very good. But one single missile from a Patriot system costs how much? $4 million. One missile. So you're not going to use those missiles to shoot down everything, because the Shahed 136 drones, they're $20,000 a pop. They're a fraction of the price. Why is that important? It means that you can throw a lot of those drones at Kyiv, and it would completely overwhelm the air defenses if you were only using very expensive Patriot. Luckily, things like the Shahed 136 drone are relatively slow. I think they fly just over 100 miles an hour. They're about 11 foot by 8 foot, so they're not that big. They carry about a 30-kilogram payload. So when we were talking last week, you were talking about the rockets being relatively small. But if you fire enough of them, they become a bit of a terror weapon rather than actually doing material damage. And I think these drones are a lot easier to shoot down. I mean, bluntly, if you lie on your back with a rifle, you can shoot them down. The only problem is that because they're flying along at just over 100 miles an hour, if you do the maths, that's about 200 feet a second. So if you fire the bullet at where it is, and it takes, by the time the bullet gets there, which could be a second time of flight, the drone is 200 feet further on. So these things are a bit more difficult to shoot down. But if you've got tracer ammunition in a machine gun, you can walk the tracer onto it. They're not that difficult to shoot down. But these things have a massive long endurance, these drones. They can be fired from a long, long way away, and undoubtedly they're part. But the big threat, I think, to Kyiv was a ballistic missile that was fired at it this week. But that we hear that Patriot, that's what the Patriot system was very effective at taking out this week. So interesting symbolically, but it also illustrates the layered air defense systems, from bullets to very expensive missiles that Kyiv needs in order to protect its seat of power, and particularly President Zelensky. For example, when we were in the Cold War, we had lots of Russian kit that was 4-barreled, fired lots and lots of rounds into the air. And you can use that sort of equipment Phoenix is one of the, and the Phalanx system is one of those systems that they use on the boats to protect the ships. Really just fill the air with a wall of lead. Bullets are cheap, and that will take them out. You don't need the very expensive high-tech systems like the Patriot. So they'll pick and choose. Now, that sounds simple when we're sat across a desk. If you know there's a missile coming in, you need to very quickly identify what sort of missile it is, what's the best way of defending, what it's going to be hitting. Is it actually going to hit something of value, in which case it might be you just let it land in a park somewhere, or do you shoot it down? And also, where do you shoot it down? We find a lot. You take out these things, but they're still going to hit the ground. They're still going to have 30 kilograms of explosive exploding, and that's why we've seen so many of the residential areas being hit in Ukraine, because they're not necessarily being targeted, but Ukraine is successfully shooting these things out of the sky, and then of course the debris tumbling to earth and causing a lot of damage on the ground.
Well, I know we're going to come to Israel a bit later, but they've got an early warning alert system for civilians. And from the time they recognise the missile incoming, the civilians got somewhere between 15 and 40 seconds to respond. That's about enough time to get underground if you've got a bomb shelter. If not, you're running like hell.
You are, and I think so. My time out in the Gulf War and in more in the Gulf than it was in Ukraine, but actually the best protection you can have is just lie on the ground, because most of these rockets and bombs, when they go off, what kills you is the shrapnel whizzing through the air. And the lower you are to the ground, the less likely you are to be struck by that. So the first port of call is just to lie down. You might still be in the open, but that's the initial best line of defense if you can. So you don't want to be running when the thing lands, because you can't outrun the shrapnel, and you present a much bigger target. But that's why certainly in Ukraine they use a lot of the underground tunnels and systems and basements to provide protection. There's a very established early warning system in the middle of Kyiv. You've probably heard it on the news every now and again when the reporters are there, these sirens start up. Bluntly, I think even the reporters were saying at the start of the war, everybody ran for cover. Now a lot of people just stand on their balcony and watch to see what's going on. It's funny how people get used to the horrors of war.
Last week we discussed Dnipro, and it seemed to be a situation where Ukraine was either vulnerable or actually saw it as an opportunity. So which way has it gone since?
Yeah, again, this is a fascinating episode in the war, and I think we'll look back on it as being potentially a pivotal moment, because as you say, there's a largely static area as the front line elsewhere, but the Ukrainian forces have got a sort of a presence on the eastern side, the Russian side of the river. Now, really, conventional military wisdom, the Russians should just push them out into the river. They haven't. What was interesting this week was that the Russian media published a statement that the Russians were not withdrawing, but were repositioning their forces to more favourable positions. But that statement was very quickly retracted and taken away. Now, what do you take from that? Do you take from that the Russians are nervous because they don't have the forces there? Or is this part of the deception campaign so that Ukraine suddenly thinks, we can move in there, and then actually the Russians jump them?
And?
Well, what's happened is that Ukrainians are continuing to build up their forces on that eastern bank. And the Russian military has now claimed, the media switched to saying that they're raining fire on the Ukrainians on the eastern bank of the Dnipro. What appears to be happening, though, is that it's winter, it's very difficult to move forces around swiftly, and that the Ukrainians are gaining a bit of momentum on that east bank of Dnipro. It's still incredibly fragile, but as we said before, if they can make it work, that could fundamentally change the dynamics of this campaign over the winter period, when a lot of analysts, including myself, would probably have assessed that over this winter period, probably not a lot was going to change. Whereas if they can get across, make a form of beachhead, and then the freeze comes in when you can start to move heavier machinery around, and it's almost certainly that the Russians will not have had the layers of defense there that they have elsewhere. So if, lots of ifs, Ukraine can capitalize, and And bluntly, I think this is about priorities. I think if you look at the battlefield, there are three main areas. Crimea is the fourth, but let's say at the moment it's more irritation in Crimea. But the three other areas where the focus is, you can't have three main efforts. You have, by definition, a single main effort. Russia's main effort appears to be the Donbass region, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, because it's pretty evident they want to seize the Donbass as a priority. They clearly don't want to give up the land bridge and therefore stop Ukraine breaking through. And they clearly don't want to see Ukraine make it across the Dnipro. But if you had to bet on back one of those three, which would it be? And it appears to be they're backing the Avdiivka because they're throwing a lot of soldiers. They're suffering huge casualties at a very difficult time of year for fighting. And it's pretty evident there that if Ukraine can hold the line there, but still make progress down to across the Dnipro, then Russia might have cause to regret that. But we've re-emphasized several times, if their priority is to take Donbass and secure Crimea, the land bridges are nice to have. If it gets lost but holds up Ukraine, wastes a lot of Ukraine armor, diminishes Ukraine's fighting ability, then Russia might consider that a price worth paying.
We touched last week that weapons and artillery were finite. There was a view that Russia was beginning to, maybe not running out, but actually getting concerned about the stock. Could it be that that's part of the equation as well? Where they throw this finite resource?
I have no doubt at all that resources logistics are a massive part of war. They always are. They're not sexy, but they are such an important part. And it's not just ammunition; it's fuel, it's food, it's all the logistics that keep a war going. And the ammunition they're getting through such huge quantities. But it's not just about the quantity; it's also the quality. Russia had started this war with literally millions of rounds of artillery, but it was unguided, so that some chap would sit at a gun all day just throwing rounds in, firing them. What's been brought into the fight by the West is radar-laid artillery. So you now have counter-battery radar that looks across the battlefield, sees when one of the Russian artillery pieces fires, provides a very accurate grid location for where that piece of ordnance is, and now sets a gun up, not necessarily a guided shell, but actually pretty accurately now can return fire on that bit of kit. So rather than now the Russian soldier sitting all day smoking a stogie and just throwing rounds into this gun and firing it, as soon as he fires it now, he knows that within a few seconds, rounds are going to start flying back at him. And that has been a big issue for Russia because they don't have the numbers of counter-battery radar, and that has changed the dynamics. And therefore, it's worth having a load of artillery rounds, but if you only need a few fired accurately, you can make better use of the stockpiles you have. So it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality.
That's very interesting, yeah. People who want to keep actually up to speed with what's going on, and I get this from people talking to me, now we're doing this, very hard for them to actually keep track of who's got the initiative. The names are quite difficult. One day Russia seems to win this, and then the next day Ukraine seems to actually take it back again, or that's what it sounds like. So, what's your take on what's actually happening on the ground?
You're absolutely right. It's such a huge battlefield. There's always some areas of progress by one side and areas of progress on the other. I think what we are seeing in big handfuls at the moment is Russia, over the spring offensive, which actually didn't start to the summer, Ukraine was largely on the front foot and Russia was largely defending, trying to take the sting out of the Ukrainians. Now, the bad thing about being on the defensive is that you are very much reactive to what the enemy are doing. You don't want to be there. You want to be on the offense. You want to be the one dictating the pace, to have momentum, to have the element of surprise on your side. With winter coming, it's evident that Russia is trying to maintain momentum and gain the initiative across in Avdiivka, which is why they're throwing so many soldiers at that fight. But to the east of Zaporizhia, where Ukraine is still trying to push through the defences, Russia is largely static. And as we say, in the Dnipro area, where really they should be on the offence, they do seem to be on the defence. Some of this is because the weather has just been deteriorating so much of late, which makes it very difficult on the battlefield.
So when does the really bad weather start? I get muddy. And then when does it finish, when stuff actually starts to freeze over?
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I get asked is, so why does a bit of rain stop the fighting? Surely they just get some wet weather clothing and carry on. Unfortunately, the terrain in Ukraine, it's the breadbasket of a lot of the world. It's a lot of wheat and grain grown, and therefore the fields become, when you get torrential rain, which they get between October and November, it becomes impassable for any machinery. The only way of getting around is on the roads, and the roads, therefore, you're very predictable. So it makes life very difficult for what they call maneuver warfare in that time. Also, frankly, it's miserable as a soldier when you're wet, you're cold. Remember trench foot from the First World War, and just staying warm so you can feel your fingers, so you're not wet. It's just miserable. And a lot of people end up just focusing on existing rather than fighting. Now, I'm not a meteorological expert, but about mid-November onwards, suddenly the temperature plummets in Ukraine and you get into a sort of deep freeze, and it stays that way then until springtime, when it just as quickly recovers again. Now, when you get the deep freeze, suddenly everything firms up, and now you can do maneuver warfare again. And that's when we might expect to see a bit more activity. The trouble is there's two things then, one of which in the summer, you can hide behind bushes, you can hide behind hedgerows. None of that is, so it's a really difficult to gain cover at all. You can't easily dig ditches. So any troop wants to dig a ditch to protect himself, can't easily do that. And also it's fiendishly difficult to stay warm in the winter. History books have been written about how difficult it is for armies to survive in the winter, let alone fight. So it will be a real test. Ukraine's made clear it wants to continue fighting through the winter. I've no doubt the West has provided a lot of state-of-the-art equipment, clothing, gloves, and everything else to keep them going. But it will still be a titanic challenge for them to maintain momentum throughout the winter.
Nobody would have thought, even just 2 years ago, that we'd be seeing major conventional warfare on European soil. And having worked in various ways with the military over many, many years, those who don't seem to know started to predict, the end of the tank. Oh, we won't need tanks anymore because that's just old hat, it'll all be digital warfare and so on. Of course, turns out not to be true. And what you describe about people fighting in the mud and the sort of things they're confronting, which people confronted in the First World War like 100 years ago, is unbelievable. It's very, very hard to get yourself into that picture. We're sitting here in this studio and people are out there fighting for their life and fighting for their country. It's unbelievable, Sean.
I think it's one of the shocks. Obviously, I've spent a lifetime in the military and we've watched technology. The West invests a lot of money in technology because, bluntly, at the end of the Second World War, there was a big review about how wars are fought. Do you really want it to be highly attritional, man-on-man charging, artillery? Are there other ways of doing it? Can we bring technology to bear? And therefore, the advent of air power, the advent of precision missiles, the drones, there's a whole... But at its heart, it's still a man versus man, woman versus woman, human versus human battle. And as we're seeing, whether it's in Israel or whether it's in Ukraine, whatever level of technology you have, and I think particularly in Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces are one of the most powerful military forces in the region because of the level of technology they have available. And yet, the fight between the IDF and Hamas ultimately comes down to individual soldiers battling and in a brutal and savage way.
Let's turn to Israel. I mean, we've got to cover the humanitarian chaos that's going on. And maybe we'll come to that in a second. But overall, I mean, last week, Gaza had been encircled largely. Hamas had been maybe, eradicated above ground. Question. So what's the actual status as you see it at the moment?
It's been a very dynamic week. As you say, once the IDF had got round the city, we wondered how on earth they were going to get in, because tanks are not the ideal weapon to get into a city. It makes you vulnerable. But actually, Hamas have largely appear to be cleared out. Yes, they've been popping out of the tunnels, ambushing the IDF as they go. And the IDF have been quite circumspect about admitting how many casualties they have taken during this phase. But there's lots of reports that it's been pretty vicious and pretty nasty fighting. There was the IDF did report about a 10-hour battle for one of the outposts where they'd cornered a load of Hamas fighters and they'd fought their way out. I think what's been interesting last week as well, that the Israelis have been telling the Palestinians in northern Gaza to leave, to use the Al Udin road to get south, to leave for safety. But of course, and about 50,000 a day have been leaving the north, but they haven't been safe in the south. Khan Yunis, which is one of the zones down there, there's still been IDF bombing there. And of course, a lot of the international community were throwing up their hands going, they won't be safe. And of course, Israel actually never said they'd be safe. It just said that they're doing a ground offensive around northern Gaza, then don't appear to be doing one of those in southern Gaza. But if you're anywhere near a Hamas fighter, then you're going to be a target. Meanwhile, what's also been interesting last week is, of course, hostages keeps cropping up. Every now and again, President Biden was looking to try and get some hostages released. It's worth remembering that America has 10 US personnel unaccounted for at the moment, so they might be hostages, and therefore they're working very hard to get them released. Hamas has various times said it would release a significant number. Near the end of the week, it talked about 70 women and children they would be prepared to release in return for a 5-day truce. But at every step of the way, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, I'm not stopping until all the hostages are released. Even some of the Qataris who've been actually trying to broker conversations, always been about the civilians. It's not been about the military hostages at all. And therefore, it doesn't look likely that there's going to be any pause unless, Hamas give up all of the hostages, over 238, I think we believe the number is now. Frankly, it looks really unlikely. That's a bargaining chip, and Hamas is not going to give up easily. And tragically, we heard this week the first IDF soldier that had been a hostage was actually killed this week, and the Hamas claimed that she died as a result of a IDF airstrike. The IDF didn't comment on how she'd passed, but it's just another example that these hostages are going to be used as pawns in this very, very dangerous game of chess over the days and weeks to come.
Last week, we spent some time talking about the ambulance convoy that was attacked and whether it's legitimate or not, depending on what the ambulances are carrying. It's very, very difficult to find the truth. I mean, difficult to impossible, with information here, counter information here. And now we've got hospitals in the news again. Can you give us a bit of an update on what we think, or what the evidence is currently showing is actually going on?
It's been quite disturbing this week, because as a former military guy, you would do your level best to keep well clear of hospitals. Not only are they protected under the law of armed conflict, but frankly, it's immoral to attack a hospital, given what they're doing, given the challenges for the individuals in there. But for all sorts of reasons, they've become a bit of a focus for this conflict, and I'll try and walk us through why. Now, clearly, the Israeli Defense Forces believe that Hamas are using the tunnels underneath Gaza, the Gaza metro, to hide, and they're particularly using underneath the hospitals because they know they can't be protected. So the IDF have convinced that that's what Hamas are doing, and they are determined to show the world So they released a picture this week, which we've got a picture we'll show of Rantishi, which is a children's hospital where the IDF claim they found a weapons stash. They showed some suicide vests, some rocket-propelled grenades, some guns, some explosives, to say, look, this is what they're doing. And why they're doing that is because what they want to show is that Hamas is compromising the security safety, and therefore undermine Hamas's legitimacy and their authority.
They had video footage as well, didn't
they? But
body cams or something.
But in contrast, though, of course, Hamas know that it's inhumane to attack a hospital. So what they're trying to do is to goad the Israelis to attacking hospitals so that the world's press sees that happening, and therefore the Hamas are trying to show the IDF as being inhumane, and therefore eroding international support for Israel. And of course, we actually are seeing that go on in the media. We're seeing greater calls for, it can't be right, you've got to protect the hospitals. And the difficulty is we don't know what the truth is of all of this.
So, I mean, in theory, laws of armed combat might say if the hospital is being used for military purposes, it's a fair game. But actually in practice, that's difficult.
It's incredibly difficult because if Hamas are not at the hospitals, then the IDF are losing all the moral high ground and will lose international support in a heartbeat. But they are clearly convinced that Hamas are in there, and there's a lot of evidence of Hamas using human shields in the past. The harsh reality is we don't know the truth. What we do know is that tragically the people who suffer most in this phase of the campaign are those sick and wounded who are actually in the hospital, and newborn babies, who desperately need help. And of course, and also never forget those, the doctors, the nurses, the staff in the hospitals who have blatantly made the decision to compromise their own safety in order to maximize patient care. Because even though they were told to vacate south, the hospitals are all full to the south, and they undoubtedly would have judged that their patients' safety would have been compromised by moving. So what bravery from the medical staff to stay put and just hope that everything ends up all right in the end. But it's hospitals shouldn't be the focus. That's the whole point of international law. And yet here we are talking about it. And as we speak this morning, there was lots of breaking news about the Israelis actually breaking into the hospital itself. Just imagine how shocking that must be. You're ill, you're wounded, and now it just gets worse. It's horrendous.
It must be somewhere between horrendous and impossible to find out what the truth is, particularly with the things moving so quickly. The BBC again today had to issue an apology on something they got wrong to do with the hospital. And, they must be, I guess one of the most careful organisations. So it's tricky.
It's very tricky. And I think particularly, obviously I do a fair bit of work with Sky, and a lot of it's in the live environment. And of course, the public are desperately keen to hear what's happening on the ground as soon as it's happening, particularly in this world of mobile phones. There's lots of imagery around. But of course, a lot of organisations, BBC use Verify, Sky does its best to verify everything it sees. But that takes time, whereas, of course, everyone wants to hear about what's happening now. And every now and again, a call is made and it's wrong. But I'm pretty confident from what I've seen so far, particularly the BBC and Sky, do their level best to try and only comment on what they're seeing. And they say IDF claims that, Hamas claims that, and then trying to make sense of what you're seeing on the ground. But both sides have their own versions of the truth in this, and both sides, particularly the Israelis, are very polished at manipulating the media. So there has to be a big degree of caution about what either side says around these issues.
So Gaza City is pretty much surrounded. Hamas, by all accounts, have been above ground taken out. So what's next and what's the plan? What outcome they're looking for? I mean, presumably a lot of the battles are now going to be underground. What above ground targets are left, and what do they mean in terms of the outcome? What do you think the plan is now?
Well, right at the start of this, as a former military guy, you're always looking at what is the military objective. What does success look like? What are the metrics of success? How will you know when you've achieved what you set out to achieve? The Israeli Defense Force were very quick after the Hamas atrocities on the 7th of October. They started their air offensive almost immediately, mobilized 350,000 people, and their military response on the ground offensive and the air has been swift, intense, and one could say largely driven initially by anger. But it was very difficult even then to work out what were they trying to achieve. Now, at the time, it felt like that, pick up some of the words that we use, some of it was destroy Hamas. Great soundbite, but difficult to achieve, but I get it. Second one was to seize Gaza City. And therefore you start to look at, well, what have they achieved so far? Now, it's difficult to know exactly how far into the city that the IDF has got now, but there was a picture released this week, which we're going to show, of the IDF inside the Gaza Parliamentary Building. Stage managed picture. Now, it isn't just a picture, it's highly symbolic, because in essence, that's the IDF saying, we're in control. We're in the middle of your government building. We are now in control. The question is, in control of what? Because it doesn't appear that Hamas have been actually destroyed in the above ground space. And certainly the Gaza metro, that labyrinth of tunnels underneath the city, there's no record from the IDF saying that they've liberated those. And that would look very difficult to do. And therefore, has the IDF liberated the Palestinian occupants of Gaza? No. Has the IDF destroyed Hamas? No. There's lots of it probably still alive and well in the underground, and several of them have moved south. So now, after what the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Authority claims that there's now over 11,000 Palestinians have died as a result of this offensive. Nearly half of those apparently are children. A spiralling humanitarian situation, and Hamas are not destroyed. What does the IDF do next? Prime Minister Netanyahu has got his forces into the middle of Gaza City, but what's actually been achieved? What are they going to do next? And the danger is that there was never a military solution to this. If the Israeli forces get trapped now, not trapped physically, but metaphorically in the city, meanwhile, there's a growing tide of international concern about the spiraling humanitarian situation. And whilst it hasn't spiraled out of control and the war escalated to other regions really yet, what are the next steps for Prime Minister Netanyahu? It's really difficult to see.
So from Israel's point of view, it could be the old adage, win the war, lose the peace.
From the moment they set foot on the ground offensive, I understand why Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted to be seen to be doing something. But one of the things that, when we were serving in the military, you're always holding your politicians to account. It's very easy to declare war. It's very easy to go into Afghanistan. Very easy to say, right, we're going to do this, going to do that. But you have to have an idea of what's going to follow that conflict. What are you going to do once you've achieved your military objectives? Because if you don't think that through, a bit like Afghanistan, sadly, you can be left with a bit of a bloody nose. Now, I'm not trying to equate any particular conflict, but on this particular one, it's very difficult to see that a clear military strategy, a complete clear military end state, and a clear military extraction plan, a plan for the what next. Because bluntly, we've said before, Gaza, 2.3 million people, they had a 50% unemployment rate, a quality of life, a standard of living that had been declining steadily over many years. And now a load of the city has been leveled. If that isn't a petri dish for future trouble, I don't know what is. So there's going to have to be some interesting planning going on if they haven't done it already, and a lot of help from the international community if they're going to help solve the next steps.
Really tough. At this point in the proceedings, we take a question from one of our viewers, and the questionnaire we've chosen this week is Rolly Cook 7447. So Rolly, thank you very much for your question. Sean.
Yeah, the question, he's asked two questions. We, mindful of the time, we're just going to choose one of them, but thank you for them both. But his question is, can we address the stalemate concern raised by the Ukrainian Chief of Staff somehow? What can the West do? And this was following the Ukraine Chief of Staff talking in a paper and a speech where he talked to the fact that what Ukraine might need in order to break the deadlock. That was misinterpreted by some as being they're in a stalemate, help. And it led to President Zelensky having to do a bit of fast talking. But the root of the question is that what does the West need to do, particularly given that the focus of attention has drifted from Ukraine to Israel at the moment? And it's a really difficult question because on the face of it, you can easily turn around and say, just keep the supply of weapons flowing into Ukraine. And that sounds simple. We have reports today that Germany has announced another massive package of aid for its next year, and that's all good, and it's undoubtedly in response to that. The real issue for me, though, is that if you continue to do what you did, you'll get what you always got. So what is it that the West has to do differently? What has Ukraine got to do differently in order not to have a repeat of another mass of weapons going in, a load of fighting, huge number of casualties, but the front line largely remains static? And part of the answer from a military perspective is using high-tech weapons. The trouble is the West is going to be really reluctant to provide state-of-the-art weapons to Ukraine because, bluntly, a lot of the weapons risk finding their way onto the black market. It's not a criticism of Ukraine, it happens in every war. But the last thing the West will want is to see any of its high-tech weapons in the hands of Russian or Chinese folk because they'll be sold to the highest bidder. It's also, we've got to be careful because it is winter, it's very difficult for the fighting at the moment. So part of this conventional wisdom would be to pause and restart. I admire Ukraine's tenacity, and therefore the West should be providing a lot of help. I know it doesn't sound like much, but warm weather gear that's properly insulated. Now that should be provided, but when I was in the military, we had our cold, wet weather gear, which we went on survival exercises with, and it got cold and very wet. So it didn't actually protect us at all. At least modern equipment, which is provided to the modern soldier, it's Gore-Tex, it's very, very good. The Russian soldiers probably don't have that, and therefore that will create a significant advantage. And the final bit of this, of course, is that not to get distracted by Israel too much. Whilst it's a horrendous war that's going on, Israel is militarily the dominant force there. Ukraine is not. And I think one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is to just make sure that we keep talking about Ukraine because they are in a battle for national survival and they are a relative minnow. Without the West's help, it would look very bleak indeed for Ukraine. And a slight departure for us. We're going to chat to Squadron Leader John Peters now. John was an RAF fighter pilot. On the first day of the Gulf War, he was shot down and he was locked up and incarcerated for 7 weeks by the Iraqis. He was brutally tortured. He went through mental turmoil, thought he was going to die. But who better to provide a perspective on what the Israeli hostages will be going through, not only what they will be going through, but also their families and what it'll be like when they are finally released. A privilege to welcome Squadron Leader John Peters. Can we start on that fateful day? You're flying your Tornado jet at very low levels on a mission into Iraq, and suddenly your day went wrong. Can we start the story there?
Yes, I was involved in 1991, 17th of January, first day of the first Gulf War. We were attacking a dispersed operating base, Ramallah Southwest, We went in for attack. It was a low-level attack, so our attack run was about 20 feet or so. We were doing about 550, 600 knots, so that's 600 plus knots, miles an hour. Went to the target, shot at the whole way in by guns and missiles, anti-aircraft. Came off, we failed on that mission. Our bombs didn't come off for various reasons. Came off the target, we were on our way home, and a surface-to-air missile went up our right-hand engine, exploded, took out the fly-by-wire system, and then anti-aircraft guns hit my right-hand wing, hit the Sidewinder missile. It ignited the rocket propellant, and a 4-metre torch of flame shot out the front of the wing. So I'm now flying in a mechanical mode rather than through computer controls, because the control surfaces have been shot with the aircraft, became a ball of flame, trying to solve the problems. And then it was going no further, so we ejected into the desert for 2 hours on the ground, and eventually about 25 soldiers found us, buried us in the sand by machine gun fire, captured, and the officer, long story short, said, "Please talk to us or we'll take you to the nasty people in Iraq, in Baghdad." So we said nothing, and we were taken to the nasty people in Baghdad. At that moment, here you are, I sat there going, I know what's going to happen to me. I'm either going to be killed and die violently here, or I'm going to disappear in the Middle East for 10 years. I had seen all the prisoner of war movies when I was younger, and known about the Vietnam POWs, and I said, Midnight Express, for instance, the guy who famous movie. And so for 10 hours, I just set my mind, I will not come out a damaged human being. If I survive this, and I come out in 10 years' time, you can pull my teeth out, you can cut my balls off, and you can break my legs. If I survive, I will not come out a damaged human being. So the things in military interrogation is they have dislocation of expectations. So they absolutely do. They remove all your aspects of time. They have a bag and head, you're blindfolded, you're handcuffed. In military, they put you in a room that's almost body temperature, which means you can't tell whether someone's you can't have that microsecond flinch before you can't feel anything coming towards you. So a hit coming towards you, it is totally out of the blue because you can't feel it. So they also use white noise which is like a crackly radio, which means you can't hear anything else. So what they're trying to do is keep you detached, which dislocates you from expectations. And then, yes, we were probably 18 hours a day in pitch black, 6 hours a day semi-pitch in a concrete box with a metal door, being systematically beaten and starved to death.
Sean, that was an amazingly moving discussion you had with John. And I remember being glued to the TV during that whole debacle, and I can still see his face ingrained in my mind on my TV set.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've known him for 40 years, and I met him when he got back, and it was a very emotional couple of days. And actually, in the middle of that interview, we had a couple of teary moments because it was all just so real. Anyway, because we've only cut 10 minutes of it for the podcast, but we are going to release the full video for you, and it's well worth a watch. None of us would have ever traded places with John, but it does give a really powerful insight into what it must be like for the hostages.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time.